first speaker, first to thank really all the organizers for the possibility to gather in a room, and especially thanks to Jean Miller for this warm welcome at AUB. We start our first panel of the themed day of our conference, the theme of which is time. And our first speaker is Fien De Block from Ghent University. She is a PhD student at Ghent, where she also studied Arabic and Islamic studies and philosophy. She worked on astrological practices, and her research project is on timekeeping in late 14th, early 15th century. So she will be presenting today on the Al-zīj al-jadīd as an instrument for 15th century timekeeping in Cairo.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, in my presentation today, I will discuss a 15th century text manuscript located at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which is known as Ibn Shatir's Kitab Al-zīj al-jadīd. Ibn Shatir was a 14th century astronomer and muwakkid of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. His new zīj has always been presented as a typical example of its genre, that is, as a mere collection of tables containing the data needed to solve all the standard problems in timekeeping. But in this presentation today, I will argue that a different approach to this text, which takes into account its materiality, provides us with an interesting view on the use and meaning of this zīj in 15th century timekeeping in Cairo, a context in which, as I will show, it was used and transmitted by a network of timekeepers. So I will first introduce Al-zīj al-jadīd and summarize the way in which the work has previously been presented in academic literature. Thereafter, I will show how this presented view reflects a strict distinction between the presumed ideal content of the text and its material use. I will argue against such a strict distinction and suggest an approach which takes into account the material use of this manuscript in the third part of my presentation, and I will end with some conclusions on the use of this manuscript in 15th century Cairo and some suggestions for further research. So previous studies on Al-zīj al-jadīd are usually part of a broader studies on the genre of the zīj in general. Most important studies have been conducted by Edward Kennedy, David King, and Julio Samso, and in their studies, these researchers treat sieges from the 9th until the 16th century, coming from an area ranging from the Iberian Peninsula in the west until India in the east. So these studies do not take into account the particular context in which these texts were produced, reproduced, and transmitted. So, for example, Kennedy summarizes the zīj or defines the zīj as follows. A zīj consists essentially of the numerical tables and accompanying explanations sufficient to enable the practicing astronomer or astrologer to solve all the standard problems of his profession, that is, to measure time and to compute planetary and stellar positions, appearances, and eclipses. The tables themselves, as the end results of theory and observation, can be used to reconstruct the underlying geometric models, as well as the mathematical devices utilized to give numerical expression to the models. So, in this way, these studies are sort of symptomatic of an essentialist view on scientific knowledge on the data, which considers contextualization rather irrelevant. So this essentialist view has in recent decades been severely criticized in research on history of science, particularly in research on history of science in a European context. But these studies, several studies have emphasized the local character of scientific practices, showing how scientific activities are always constituted by and intelligible within a certain cultural and material context. So this essentialist view on scientific knowledge, which has been criticized, is linked to a corresponding view on scientific texts and on texts in general, which consists in the assumption that texts are the dead material that contains the ideal content. And in spite of its naturalness to us, the dichotomy between material carrier and ideal content brings up a lot of problems, as is shown in recent studies of, for example, Bernd Frohman and Karin Shemla. They argue that first, a satisfactory definition, unique definition of the content of a text can never be given, because even with scientific text, interpretation always depends on who is who is writing and reading the text, and in which particular circumstances. And furthermore, writing and reading a text, as Shemla and Frohman say, is itself a constitutive part of scientific practices. So, as such, I argue with Shemla and Frohman that texts are sort of discursive artifacts. That means they come from somewhere, they have certain agendas. To put it another way, I consider texts, and this text in particular today, to be as much an instrument as is, for example, the case for an astrolabe or a quadrant in scientific practices. And I want to look at the text as it was used as a material. So on a historiographical level, I will use two sources to reconstruct the use of this text. On the one hand, I will look at the traces of the manuscript itself, which provide evidence of its use. On the other hand, I will also look at a biographical dictionary for information on the scholars who used this text in 15th century Cairo. I will argue that if we look at these traces and take into account what people did with this text in the 15th century, the text appears as a central instrument in at least 3 different ways. That is, first as an astronomical instrument, second as a didactical instrument, and third as a social instrument. So these 3 ways are, of course, strongly intertwined. So I will argue for this in what follows. On the front page of this manuscript, Ibn Shatir is indeed mentioned as the author of the text, but it is indicated that he has already died at the moment the manuscript was written. So the data on the front page of the manuscript, however, reveal that this work was possessed and used by a certain Al-zīj al-Wafa'i, who is a famous astronomer and muwakkit who lived in 15th century Cairo. He died around 1470. So after the death of Ibn Shatir, who died in 1375. In the first note is a note which stands just below the title of the manuscript, which says Hada Khat al-Sheikh Al-zīj al-Wafa'i. And this note is, you see it again on the first page of the introduction in the margin, just below another note, which says that this text has been transmitted from a draft version of the hand of Ibn Shatir himself. And then there's a third note also on the front page of the manuscript, which I think says that al-Wafa'i possessed this siege, and he is also called, if I read it correctly, a muwakkit on the second line of the Mosque of Al-Maridani in Cairo. So in the lemma on al-Wafa'i in As-Sakhawi's dictionary, in biographical dictionary, the letter mentions that al-Wafa'i was a famous muwakkit who manufactured and owned a lot of instruments and also wrote several didactical works on the use of them. He also mentions the Muwaqqids Ibn al-Majdi and Nur ad-Din al-Naqash as the two most important teachers with whom al-Wafa'i studied ilm al-miqat. Both of them were also instrument makers and also had ties to another Muwaqqid who's also mentioned on the front page of the manuscript in a note that is a Sufi. On the front page of the manuscript, there's a note that says I, which I presume is al-Wafa'i, because it's just below the note that says that this manuscript was from al-Wafa'i. I saw in the handwriting of the very learned Shamsuddin Muhammad ibn Abi al-Fath Sufi, on the back of the book of his own composition, which was in his own handwriting, a note that I'm copying here. So this refers to Shamsuddin al-Sufi, examined a zīj by Ibn al-Shatir, which he entitled Nihayat al-Ghayat fi al-A'mal al-Falakiyat, in which he marked in the service of the noble as-Saifi Tankis, viceroy of the Syrian realm. So on the basis of this, I tried to reconstruct the network of timekeepers around this text in this diagram. So al-Wafa'i, who uses this text, was himself not a student of Ibn al-Shatir, but he was a student of Ibn al-Majdi, who was on his turn a student of Sibt al-Maridani, who was on his turn a student of Ibn al-Shatir. Ibn al-Majdi, al-Wafa'i, and al-Sufi were contemporary muwaqqids in Cairo, and they all the mentioned muwaqqids, Nur ad-Din al-Naqash is the second most important teacher of al-Wafa'i. And an important aspect of this is that all the mentioned muwaqqids, including Ibn al-Shatir, made their own instruments. So this is a reconstruction of the note on the front page. So there's a note written by al-Wafa'i, who uses this zīj, referring to a note written by a Sufi on the basis of another zīj of Ibn al-Shatir, and he may have also used an older lost version of Al-zīj al-jadīd, but we don't know that. When we consider the zīj among these instrument and instrument makers, the question arises to which extent it can be seen as sort of a discursive counterpart of the astronomical instruments these scholars made. Further research on this, I think, is needed, but I think it will certainly provide us with interesting new insights on these texts as used among other more technical instruments. Second, I think this zīj was also used as a didactical instrument. As-Sakhawi also mentions that al-Wafa'i worked as a muwaqqid in the Mu'ayyadiyya Mosque, the Mosque of al-Maridani, and the Azhar Mosque. And in a recent study of Sonia Branches, she shows how muwaqqids in the early 15th century were almost always also mudarris of ilm al-miqat, among other disciplines, in and outside the mosques where they worked as muwaqqids. And a lot of the works of al-Wafa'i that have survived up until today are didactical treatises on the use of instruments. So I think to fully understand this zīj, that we have to study it at least partly as a didactical tool, sort of an exemplar for the students of ilm al-miqat. And when we consider the work as a didactical tool, it makes sense that the values of the tables in it are calculated for Damascus and not for Cairo, whereas it was used in Cairo. The values in the work are calculated for a terrestrial latitude of 33 degrees and 30 minutes, which is the equivalent of the latitude of Damascus. And the ascension tables, the tables of the rising times of the planets in the work, are all calculated on the basis of this value. Whereas it was not unusual that zīj calculated for other latitudes were used in new places, because it's always possible to recalculate for a new place. Looking at the work in this way, as a didactical tool, may help us to understand the meaning of these Syrian data in an Egyptian context. Throughout the work, there's also recurrent phrase structure, as exemplified in this picture, the writer always tells how to calculate certain unknown values starting from different known values. So it's a structure that goes like, if you want to know this, then you have to do that. If you want to know this, etc. And then last but not least, I also argue that the zīj was used as a social instrument, that is, as a text with which certain scholars associated themselves in order to gain a certain status and authority. According to As-Sakhawi, al-Wafa'i did not only work in the Mu'ayyadiyya as a muwakkid, but also lodged there. As Michael Chamberlain has pointed out in his famous study on Damascus, holding a mansab or an office in a religious institution was a widespread practice that nonetheless suffered a great deal of critique from certain groups of scholars. Especially the use of the lodging facilities of such an institution was considered below the standards of certain scholarly families. Scholars from wealthy scholarly families generally did not live in religious institutions, even if they worked in them. So I want to suggest to link this to the fact that a lot of muwakkids I have mentioned had grown up in artisans' families or had at least several artisans in the network of people around them. As for example, Konrad Hirschler describes in his study, the later 14th century Mamluk Sultanate witnessed a growing upward social mobility, of which I suggest these people who could be exemplary. Al-Wafa'i is at least a scholar who fits into this picture. And another thing which appears to me as fitting in this context is the extensive line of scholars that are being quoted at the beginning of the work as predecessors in the field. In the introduction, several well-known scholars are mentioned, among them Al-Majriti, Ibn al-Walid al-Maghribi, Ibn al-Haytham, Nasiruddin al-Tusi, etc. We do not find any reference to any of the works of those scholars. Only their names are mentioned, putting Ibn al-Shadir at the end of this knowledge transmission chain, and the name of Al-Wafa'i, who used this manuscript, next to it in the margin. So it's the note in the margin that I showed here, which is next to the introduction. So, I believe that this can be understood within the context of what we know about practice of knowledge transmission in Mamluk Cairo. As Jonathan Berkey's famous study on this subject has highlighted, education in the Mamluk Sultanate was based on individuals, on a personal relation between teacher and student rather than on institutions. And by studying with a certain teacher, part of the authority and status of the teacher was transmitted to the scholar. If we look at the attempted scheme of transmission, taking into account the transmission of authority, what the text does then the use of a 14th century manual whose writer already earned his stripes in society, Ibn al-Shatir was rather famous, is a logical choice in augmenting the authority and status of the one using the work. So, to come to my conclusions, in this presentation, I have tried to approach the manuscript of Al-zīj al-jadīd from a different perspective than it has already been studied, rather than abstracting the ideal content from the manuscript, so the data. I have attempted to reconstruct the way in which it was used in its materiality as an instrument in the network of 15th century timekeepers in Cairo. I've argued that if we look at the text in this way, that is with attention to its background, its use, and its role in specific practices in society, The zīj presents itself as an actively used instrument in both astronomical research and in didactical practices, rather than as a mere reference work. Of course, this is only a starting point for a different approach of texts on timekeeping. I hope to further pursue this material approach, not only to this zīj, but to other texts on timekeeping as well. And I believe that this approach does not only open up new avenues for research on timekeeping in this period, but also for the broader discipline of history of science in the Mamluk Sultanate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, really. I guess Fien De Block really opened our view and perception of texts in a very fine manner, taking a good example. So, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. But yeah, I wondered about because it's really great that you're looking at the materiality of the manuscript, and to some extent, I was wondering whether there's any chance to dig deeper into the materiality and just thinking, for example, for Ottoman period manuscript of the popular religious culture, there was a great work coming out looking at usage traces, which pages were actually used, whether they're writs, whether you see that readers focus on certain passages, fingerprints, etc. So you really get a feeling for the materiality of the manuscript. Is there any chance to do that with these manuscripts, or are they just perfect, pristine, and there's nothing on them?
No, I think that certainly is possible. I looked at my own photographs of the manuscript again yesterday, just when I was preparing for the presentation, and then I saw that certain pages are really, don't seem used, almost don't seem used, and then other pages, especially the tables at the end of the manuscript, are really a lot, they seem to have been used a lot more, which is very interesting to me because the last part of the zīj contains information on planetary conjunctions. So it's the material which is on the border between astronomy and astrology, and it seems to have been used more than the first part of the zīj, which is which contains the data for which a zīj is famous. So the timekeeping, theoretical data. So, yeah.
So.
Hi, Nasser Kalamoun. I want to ask about the third one, social context, zīj as a social instrument. Can you elaborate on this?
I added this context because I think that it's not because this is a scientific text that it can't be used as in a way for scholars to profile themselves. I mean, of course, the data were also used for timekeeping and the more known scientific applications, but it's an aspect of these texts that is often neglected, that they also had an important social role. That's, yeah.
You mean social class, they were respected or being classified as?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I understand your question.
The hierarchy of religious
yes,
scholars and
yes.
so.
I just tried to understand why a scholar in 15th century Cairo used and transmitted the text of a famous astronomy scholar from 14th century Damascus, and I think the status that goes with the text and with the name of Ibn Shatir must have certainly played a role there. So.
Thank you. Yes, please.
You mentioned non-converty and the personal relationship between the teacher and the student. I'd like to challenge that. So I'll ask you the following question. Was there any indication that this book was transmitted orally from teacher to student, or it was read by the person who bought it at home. Because, I mean, the idea of ilm is specific to hadith, and the transmission of it, and the use of isnad is really specific to hadith. So, are there any sama'at, for example, on this book? Please mention.
I haven't found one up until now, but there are some notes on the manuscript which I still haven't been able to read. But I wanted to emphasize the way that this scholar refers to individuals rather than to astronomical theories. So it seems to be more important for him to state that he's working in a tradition of these people than to state that he's working in a tradition of, for example, the planetary model that Ibn Shatir has brought up. So that's what I wanted to emphasize. I don't know if...
Does that include enough education of a teacher-student relationship?
Yeah, I Yes.
How would you know this stuff on your own? But that's my
But I didn't want to state that all these people were really teachers, students of themselves. I just wanted to emphasize the fact that individuals were brought up, and knowledge transmission, is in the Mamluk Sultanate is very much a case of individuals. I hope that's an answer to your question.
So, if there are no questions, I will ask a question myself about you just indicated that the last part, the more astrological one, was maybe more used. Okay, I find it very convincing, the educational use. But going back to the timekeeping practice, so how would one, like Wafa'i, who knows his instruments, I mean, did he really needed to use these tables for saying when the prayer in Al-Mu'ayyadiyya needs to be held? How did he really calculate the prayer time, for example?
Yeah, the data in the zīj were used to adhere the instruments they used for specific situations. That's why I thought it was interesting that this data, which are calculated for Damascus, are used in Cairo. But yeah, it's always possible to recalculate. It's not that difficult. So, it was, one could always, if one had the theoretical education needed, one could always calculate these things themselves. But I think it's also a matter of, you have to calculate these things on a regular basis, so it goes a lot faster when you have these tables and you just use the data without having to calculate them time and time again. So,
yeah.
I think.
Well, we have five.
About 25 minutes per paper.
Okay, I thought 10 minutes discussion. No. Because, okay. So then I thank you very much.